Thank you, Manon, and thank you very much for organizing this panel. And I think we all agree by being here that climate breakdown and exploding inequalities are two of the most lethal challenges that Europe faces today. Not the only ones, but two of the most important ones, I think. And a simple arithmetic of growth is that at 3% growth per year, which might seem a little if it has to do with your salary, but if it has to do with the global economy, it means that it will be 10 times bigger by the end of this century. Reducing emissions in an economy and energy system that it's 10 times bigger is, I would say, next to impossible. One could welcome then, on a first read, the fact that Europe seems to enter a new era of low or zero growth. But this is obviously, and we heard that in this panel, it's not good news, given that lack of growth within the current growth-based systems increases inequalities even more than the dire state they are now. So in my presentation, I want to directly confront, at a general level, this new question that I think we are facing as societies, but also as economists in the 21st century. So is it possible to reduce inequalities without growth? This question, we addressed it in a recent paper that I was invited a little bit to reflect on what we learned there in this presentation. And it's a joint work that I did with my colleagues in Barcelona, Tilman Hartley and Jeroen van den Berg. So it's a simple paper, and I'll try to communicate the main messages. But we organized our thinking about a well-known identity or well-known identity for economics and inequality nerds like many of us here. Which is Thomas Piketty's famous formulation that as long as R is the rate of return to wealth, so how much money you get back on the wealth you have in your saving and investing. If R is higher than G, the rate of GDP growth, then income inequalities increase. This happens, just to explain very simply, many of you might be aware of that, but it's important that we are all on the same ground. This happens because the income of wealth holders rises faster than the income of society as a whole, the average that Lucas talked at the very beginning. So a greater share of national income ends up at the hands of those who own wealth at the expense of those who work for a living, those who just have access to G. To explain this with an example of our favorite person in this room, Jeff Bezos, he might get hiccup by so many references, you know. He just have woken up now and he has a crazy hiccup, he will know what it is. So if Jeff Bezos or Carlos Slim, or you can substitute the name with whatever you want, if his return to his investments are 7% every year, his or rather his grandchildren's income from wealth by the end of the century will be 180 times bigger. This is just to understand what it means compound growth, like 7% per year. It's like an incredibly big amount accumulated over a relatively long but not so long period of time. It's 80 years from now, no? If the economy instead grows at 3%, a level that is considered a healthy rate of growth for an economy, it will be 10 times bigger. So compare 10 to 180. This means that a much greater portion of the income the economy produces each year will end up at the hands of Bezos or his descendants. If we want to be a little bit more studious, and you'll excuse me that, it's not, I hope I'm not panicking anyone who hasn't seen math symbols for a while, but it's very, very basic, but it's important to be a little bit rigorous here. So if we want to be a little bit more rigorous, we can add in this equation an extra factor S. S is the savings rate of income from wealth and ranges from 0 to 1. So this basically accounts for the portion of the income that is being saved. In the extreme case that S is 0, the wealthy do not save any of their income and the wealth does not increase. If Bezos and his children, in other words, spend all of their income partying, which is a likely outcome if you're the child of a very rich person, then by the end of the century, they're not going to have this 180 times more wealth, no? Maybe if they spend it all, they're going to have exactly the same returns as their father. If they save it of he and they save it all instead, and they get the 7% return, they will have 180 times more. So many have interpreted, but not Piketty himself, no? But many people who have read that have interpreted this basic equation as a call for rising G, no? Rising G, the rate of growth, so that it's at the same level as the returns to Bezos. But what if we are facing a world where G, that is economic growth, cannot and should not be more than 0 or less than 0, which is what we are discussing here by talking about beyond growth. So then there are 3 basic strategies to equilibrate this unbalanced equation. And I want to talk about these 3 strategies and what they mean in terms of policies. So the first strategy is to accept that SR is higher than G, but then redistribute the wealth that is being produced so that everyone, and not just Bezos, benefits from the returns on wealth. The second approach is the one that we've discussed a lot today, which is to reduce the returns from wealth, basically by taxing wealth. And I'm not going to go more on that, given that it's been covered quite extensively in this table. The third strategy, which I think is important to consider, is to reduce R, that is to reduce the return to wealth, so that again, SR is not higher than G, the rate of growth, G that it's going to be low, right? So in our paper, we identified different policy options for each of these strategies and gave current and past examples of their application. For wealth redistribution, one can think of ways to share capital more equally, such as, for example, public or worker ownership of productive firms, or other ways through which the state can intervene and broaden access to capital. This is an important point, because this is not a redistribution after wealth is produced. It's who is producing wealth from the very beginning. And the fastest way to redistribute wealth and take it out of the hand of the Bezos of this world is that the state controls a more substantial part of the productive apparatus than it currently does, which has many other benefits other than only redistributive ones. We talked about the global wealth tax. And the final set of policies that I want to talk about, but that they cover a broad range of interventions, are about governments intervening and reducing the returns on wealth directly. One way is by putting limits on interests or on rents, how much money you can make from interest and from rent. They can tax, for example, progressively incomes. This includes policies of returning of taxing progressively the incomes from the wealth on the current income, or they can tax the income from unproductive rents, say by taxing the ownership of land or of resources such as fossil fuels. But it's not only unproductive, it's destructive. Returns to wealth can be reduced also indirectly by securing the worker's share of income in an otherwise steady or contracting economy. This includes policies for stronger organizing and bargaining rights, or social policies such as job guarantee, a universal basic income, or free public services that effectively secure that there is a real income of working people that is guaranteed. And these are all the things that we are discussing here, not by coincidence. Finally, investment policies can reorient economies towards sectors where the human element is essential and cannot be easily substituted by machine, by capital. This reduces the returns to those who own the machines, the capital. Such sectors to which we can reorient the economy include health, education, care, or the arts and the humanities. So none of these policies is sufficient on its own. It can complement the others. You cannot do a silver bullet, as you just said. No, there is not a silver bullet of a wealth tax. And all together can work to decrease inequalities in a context of low, zero, or negative growth. This is why we call such policies post-growth policies. You may have heard more or less the same policies by Jason Hickel in the opening plenary, arriving from a different angle. But we arrive exactly on the same angle if we just focus on one thing, which is how do we reduce inequalities in a non-growing economy. Suffices to say that none of this is easy politically, because R is not just a symbol in an equation. It would be easy if that was the case, no? It is the income of wealthy people that hold disproportionately much political power in otherwise democratic societies. Some of them will naturally do what they can do to protect their profits and rents. Such vested interests, I would conclude, stand now on the way of adapting to a new future, one where growth is no longer desirable and might not even be possible. Governments, I would suggest, can and should overcome resistance from these interests and bring forward the necessary structural reforms that will allow societies to prosper without growth. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Georgos. If you allow me, I will directly follow up with you and I'll ask a few questions. I just remind you the Slido app if you want to ask question. I'll follow up quickly with a few quick questions here and then pass you on the floor, being on Slido or Orly, so you can already write down your question. But I'll just ask you slightly provocative questions as a follow-up. You kind of already touched upon the question of it's clear that the policies that consist in growing the cake and redistribute the cake is over. But it's not clear, and that's part of the debate we're having here. We've been calling the whole conference post-growth. And there's a debate on whether you should be agnostic about it or whether you should promote degrowth. And my understanding is that you're rather on the second family. But then can you explain it? I know Lucas, for example, might have a little bit different opinion, but can you explain it? How is that compatible, and how would you manage to eventually reduce inequality within a degrowth starting right away? And how would you do that in practice in just a few minutes so that we can have something lively among everyone?
Thanks. I mean, the question is, how do we understand degrowth? And I think it's a mistake to think that we who talk about degrowth understand it as a negative GDP. I know that it's an obvious misunderstanding, and it's not strange that this misunderstanding is happening, because we understand growth as positive GDP, so someone imagines by the word degrowth that it's negative GDP. Well, we've gone to long lengths to argue that it's a different trajectory, and it's on the one hand agnostic to GDP, but on the other hand, it shifts that it has to be something very, very different from the current growth economy. So it's not tinkering at the edges of this growth economy and then being agnostic about what the result is, or implementing good policies as we hear and then we see what happens. No, it's much more than that. It's, again, I would refer to the opening talk of Jason Hickel today. You understand that the type of change that he was describing is quite radical. It's about control of certain parts of the productive capacities of countries, reducing certain activities dramatically, redistributing dramatically, changing the type of economic structure that it's there. So it's a very, very different model than what we understand currently as the growth-based economy. So this is what we are signifying with the word degrowth. Now, whether this will lead, I find it very, very unlikely that we would have a growth of 2 or 3%. I'm saying an economy that's 10% times bigger, doing all these things and restructuring the economy in this way. I mean, it's creating a confusion in my mind, you know. To think that it could be like, I don't know, a 0% GDP growth, or it could be something less. If we are serious about ignoring GDP as an indicator, I wouldn't get in that conversation. So I would be agnostic about the growth. I would be agnostic about what the growth means in terms of GDP. But I think what the term wants to keep on the table is that it's not going to be something here and there, moving a little bit the pieces of the puzzle. It's something much more dramatic than that. Not dramatic, dramatic in a good way.
Thanks very much, which brings me to another